Let's start this third and final session today, titled Empathetic Joy. Let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this session. We'll start with a meditation on some ways of dealing with anger. Following that, we'll be dispelling some common misconceptions regarding anger. And in that regard, looking at this topic called cognitive fusion, trying to answer why is it that we get angry with others who behave badly? And why is there so much low self-esteem and self-hatred in our modern society? Following that, a short review of some of the earlier points. And then we'll briefly look at these preliminary practices that we've already seen are very important to provide a foundation for cultivating loving kindness and compassion. Then I want to look at this topic of compassion burnout, to come to really see that actually it's technically it's not compassion burnout, it's empathy burnout. And then we'll look at the empathetic joy. We'll do a meditation on empathetic joy and then finish with question answer as per normal. But let's first do meditation, looking at some ways of dealing with anger. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. We begin, as always, by preparing the body, setting it into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Vigilant posture is to keep the back nice and straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Releasing all activities of the mind and simply allowing it to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. So let's now have a look at some ways of dealing with anger. And when we apply antidotes to anger, we're not trying to suppress the anger. but rather we're trying to look at the situation in a different way so that the anger simply dissolves. And remember, anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because it believes that object is a source of our suffering. So let's have a look at some different approaches. First, bring to mind a situation where you got angry or frustrated when something didn't work out the way you wanted it to. And picture the scene very clearly. And then ask yourself, could I have done something about that situation? If we can do something to change a situation, then there's no need to get angry. We simply make the change. And if there's nothing we can do to change a situation, then what's the use in getting angry? It doesn't help. And next, think of a situation where you got angry when someone else criticized you. And again, picture the scene clearly. And again, ask yourself, was their criticism valid? If what they said was true, why get angry? Because they're giving us the chance to correct our faults and to improve ourselves. And if what they said was untrue, then since they're completely mistaken, we can simply ignore what they're saying. And regardless of whether their criticism was valid or not, they are providing us the opportunity to practice patience, to develop the quality of patience. So, in fact, they're being very kind to us. Next, think of a situation where you got angry in a conflict with another person. And again, picture the scene clearly. Now, instead of looking at the situation from your own perspective, assume the perspective of the other person. Try to imagine how that situation would look to them. And when we try to understand their viewpoint, we can see that they're just like us, trying to be happy and trying to be free of suffering. And that due to their confusion and mental afflictions, they're just creating suffering for themselves and the people around them. And so, in this way, by distinguishing the person from their behavior, we can begin to develop compassion for them. And if their behavior is inappropriate, we can address their bad behavior without attacking the person, without getting angry. Next, think of a situation where you often get irritated or frustrated. And allow some irritation or frustration to arise. And now, instead of focusing on the situation, look directly at your irritation or frustration. Don't try to push it away. Just look at it directly. What is the nature of that irritation or frustration? Is it something solid and concrete, or does it change over time? And if we look directly at the irritation or frustration in this way, does it have any power over us? Do we need to fight with it? Or does it simply start to dissolve? And next, think of a person who often makes you angry or irritated. And picture this person very clearly in front of you. And then mentally dissect this person and try to pinpoint exactly what it is that actually makes you angry or irritated. Is it something they say? If so, words are just sounds. So, which particular sound is irritating? Or perhaps it's something they do, some behavior that you find irritating. Actions are just movements of the body. So, which particular movement of the body is irritating? Or perhaps it's simply their appearance that is irritating. Appearance is simply collections of colors and shapes. So which particular color or shape is irritating? When we investigate in this way, we can see how it is our mind that creates the irritating person by interpreting the situation in a certain way and then applying labels such as annoying or irritating. We then go on to mistaking our concept of the person for the person themselves. We see them as inherently irritating. And so, in conclusion, recognize that by engaging in these reflections repeatedly, relating them to situations in our life, we can clear up a lot of anger and frustration. And we can develop a much more healthy way of looking at things and make a strong determination to do so. We can bring the meditation to a close. Let's have a look at a couple of common misconceptions regarding anger. Now, in general, we sort of understand that anger is quite destructive, and we want to be able, we should eliminate it. But still, there's often a doubt that says, well, actually, I need anger in certain situations. I need anger to be able to deal with difficult situations. Otherwise, I can't deal with difficult situations. Now, no one is debating the fact that anger is not forceful. But as we've seen in the definition, and we know from our own example, our own experience, is that anger exaggerates and distorts, which means that when we're gripped in strong anger, we don't see the situation clearly. And we know from our own experience, when that's the case, we often overreact or react in a very inappropriate way that not only doesn't resolve the problem, it often makes it much worse. And so the Buddhist answer is that we don't need anger to deal with difficult situations. The Buddhist answer is practice patience instead of anger. But then when that's explained, then another doubt comes, thinking that, well, if I practice patience, people will just walk over the top of me. I'll be just like a doormat, won't I? Again, patience is not a behavior, at least how it's defined in Buddhism. Patience is a mental attitude. Patience is defined simply as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So when Buddhism recommends that we practice patience, what they're saying is that when we're faced with a difficult situation, remain calm. Because if we remain calm, we have a better chance of being able to more accurately and clearly see what's actually going on and therefore make a better response in that situation. But then actually, sometimes we may need to be forceful in our response. And if we don't use anger, then how can we be forceful when necessary in difficult situations? And the Buddhist answer is use compassion. And then often another doubt comes, thinking that actually anger is a sign of strength and compassion is a sign of weakness. Actually, it's the exact opposite. Anger is a sign of weakness, compassion is a sign of strength. Because if we resort to anger in difficult situations, we resort to trying to dominate people to resolve issues. That's a sign of weakness. And compassion is a sign of strength. And remember, compassion is not about sitting there smiling and saying nice things to people. Compassion is the wish for them to be free of suffering and its causes. Which means if that person is behaving badly, the compassionate thing to do is to help stop that person from behaving badly. For example, if that person is physically attacking us, then if we simply sit there and allow them to attack us, that's not compassion, because in some ways we're even encouraging them to behave badly. That's the opposite of compassion. The compassionate thing to do is to restrain that person using physical force if necessary. But if we allow anger to get into that situation, we'll probably use excessive force, overreact, and then the situation will get out of control. So they are some misconceptions regarding anger. And again, here, anger in Buddhism is really focusing at the level of intention, the intention to harm. So it's not so much about the physical and verbal expressions, but rather what's driving that. So if we're using very forceful language and behavior with a motivation of wishing to help, that's compassion. If our motivation is wish to harm, that's anger. Now I'd like to look at a topic called cognitive fusion. On the basis of the question, why do we get angry with others who behave badly? And I think there's a simple answer to that. Now, if someone is behaving badly, the correct perspective is there is a person doing or engaging in a bad action. That's the correct perspective. But very often in this situation, we have a very different perspective. Instead of that perspective, we often have the perspective of, oh, there's a bad person, there's a horrible person, nasty person, evil person. So what we've done there is we have fused the person to the behavior and made them one thing. This is called cognitive fusion. This is a false, invalid perspective because there's two things here. There's a person and their behavior. But if we fuse them together and make them one thing, then that's invalid because there's two things here. And if we do this cognitive fusion, we're in trouble. Because in any given situation, we've got two choices, accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But if we do cognitive fusion and we fuse that behavior to the person, we end up directing our rejection to the person. We end up attacking the person, getting angry at the person. And if we understand that that's not a helpful thing to do, the only other option is accept. But then if we accept based on cognitive fusion, that translates into accepting their bad behavior. And they're the two choices we've got if we do cognitive fusion. And then compassion becomes difficult because having compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying is, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind, but that's what it feels like. So we often then think they don't deserve compassion because they're just such a bad, horrible, nasty person. And it's even worse than that because we end up with a fixed, biased view of that person. They're a bad person. And then it becomes difficult to acknowledge anything good they do. Because if they do something good, then bad people don't do good things. So if they do something good, we'll brush it off and say, well, they didn't really mean it because they're just such a horrible, bad person. So we end up with a fixed, biased view of them. And then also it ends with conflict because, yes, he's the bad person or they're the bad people, we're the good people. So let's get rid of those bad people out there because we're the good people here. So we end up with conflict. And then also we end up judging the person, attacking the person. And that's not helpful. So the answer to this is simply don't do cognitive fusion because cognitive fusion is a false, invalid perspective. Simply adopt the correct perspective and acknowledge there is a person doing or engaging in some bad or harmful behavior. Then we can accept the person, i.e., have forgiveness and compassion for the person, but at the same time, not tolerate their negative behavior, reject their negative behavior, and address their negative behavior and help that person to overcome their negative behavior. So therefore, compassion becomes much more easy. And then we end up with a balanced view of the person because they're just like us. They're a person, sometimes do good things, sometimes do bad things, and we can acknowledge both sides of that. And therefore, it leads to cooperation. It's not like us versus them, us good people versus those bad people. We're all people, all sometimes doing good things, sometimes doing bad things. So let's help each other to overcome those negative behaviors. And so therefore, with the correct perspective, instead of judging the person, we will evaluate the behavior. Now here, a doubt or confusion comes up. We often hear in the modern world, we should be non-judgmental. But unfortunately, many of us are doing cognitive fusion. And so non-judgmental on the basis of cognitive fusion translates into accept everything. And we see this sometimes. People really think, oh, I have to be non-judgmental. I have to accept, because there's either accept or reject. And judging is rejecting. So therefore, if we can't do that, we have to accept. But if we do cognitive fusion, then we end up accepting all bad behavior. And that's not helpful at all. So the answer, so non-judgmental doesn't mean accept everything. This would be an ethical disaster. Non-judgmental means don't do cognitive fusion. Have the correct perspective and evaluate behavior. We must evaluate our own and others' behavior and correct our own behavior and help others to overcome their negative behavior. So if we adopt the correct perspective, then it will be, we won't get angry with others who behave badly. It'll be much more easy then also to cultivate compassion for them and help them to overcome that negative behavior. And similarly, this is why I think there is an epidemic of so much low self-esteem and self-hatred in the modern world. Because again, if we do a negative behavior, the correct perspective is acknowledging I did this harmful, bad action. But we do the cognitive fusion. And so rather than seeing that way, our perspective is, oh, I'm just such a bad person. I'm such a horrible person. And then accept and reject. And so we either reject ourselves and then we feel guilty, because guilt is coming from cognitive fusion. Because if we have done a bad action and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me, bad me. It's based on cognitive fusion. And so guilt, we don't need to feel guilty about anything because it's focused, it's based on a false perspective. Because all it does is it paralyzes us and makes us feel bad. It's not even addressing the negative behavior. And so therefore the similar thing, if we do cognitive fusion, we will end up simply judging and criticizing ourselves, condemning ourselves, hating ourselves. And then we end up with a fixed bias view. I'm just such a bad person. And we end up with low self-esteem. So the simple solution again to all of this is don't do cognitive fusion. Simply acknowledge I have done this bad action. Then we can accept, so we can accept ourselves, and at the same time, not tolerate our negative behavior, evaluate our behavior so we can have forgiveness and compassion for ourselves. We can have good self-esteem and at the same time not tolerate our negative behavior and regret. So this is the big difference between regret and guilt. Guilt is based on cognitive fusion. If we've done something harmful and we regret, what are we focusing on? The bad behavior. So regret comes from a correct perspective, and it will help us to then address that negative behavior. Whereas guilt doesn't address the negative behavior, just makes us feel bad. And so if we can do this, then we can really overcome a lot of low self-esteem and self-hatred. Simply adopt the correct perspective. Now, unfortunately, because there's an epidemic of low self-esteem and self-hatred in the modern world, then there are therapies to deal with that. But unfortunately, some of those therapies to overcome low self-esteem is we should simply, instead of saying I'm a bad person, reinforce that I'm a good person. I'm a good person. So yes, it's helpful to have a balanced view of ourselves, to focus on the positive aspects of our behavior. But unfortunately, because we're in so much cognitive fusion, simply acknowledging I'm a good person we go into cognitive fusion again on the positive side. And then with that, what that can happen is that it can become a big ego trip. Yes, I'm good, but I'm actually special. I'm better than everyone else. And then because I'm such a good person, then, you know, good people don't do bad things, because so everything as I do is good, you know, and we don't acknowledge any bad behavior. And again, we're still stuck in us versus them, because I'm really one of those really good people, but there's still some bad people out there. We need to get rid of those bad people out there. But then if we do that cognitive fusion, but then we really see that actually I'm not such a good person, then we'll just flip to the other extreme, and that'll confirm, oh yeah, I'm really such a bad person. So the answer to low self-esteem is not simply to focus, to say I'm a good person. The answer is really to avoid cognitive fusion, to not wrongly identify ourselves with our bad behavior. Then we can have really good, authentic good self-esteem, but at the same time not tolerate our negative behavior, to address our negative behavior. And so all this cognitive fusion is, whether it's on the negative behavior or positive behavior, it's wrong identification. It's wrongly identifying ourselves, in this case, not only with behavior, but we can also say to wrongly identify ourselves with our thoughts, emotions, memories, habits, behavior, personality, or even body and mind. Because we often, you know, let's say we have a strong habit of getting angry. How often do we hear people say, I'm an angry person, that's me, you better accept that. And then people feel stuck because I'm an angry person. So they end up with a fixed biased view of themselves and think there's no hope. So rather than think like that, we can say, I'm a person who has a very strong habit of being angry. And then we can still feel good about ourselves and then work to overcome that habit of getting angry. So that cognitive fusion I find very helpful to understand that. And unfortunately, I think we've been programmed to think and speak in this way since we were very young, through our parents and education and our society. That, you know, like, for example, if some young child at home is misbehaving, you know, how often do we hear the parent go, bad girl, bad boy? And of course, no wonder we end up thinking we're bad, because we hear that all the time. And then we use that same language. So I think one way to help us to overcome this is to start thinking and speaking differently, to think, actually, there's no such thing as a bad person. There's only people who sometimes engage in bad behavior. And if we think like that and speak that way, then I think it becomes easier to have a correct perspective, and easier to have compassion, and less likely to get angry at people. So if we say you're, you know, we think and say you're a bad person, then naturally anger will arise. But if we simply think and say, well, you're a person who's engaging in some bad, harmful behavior, then it's easier to have compassion for them and then help them to overcome that negative behavior. So I find that cognitive fusion very helpful, to understand it and how to overcome the cognitive fusion. And that will, I think, really help us to reduce mental afflictions such as anger, and increase positive qualities such as compassion. Short review of the earlier points. Again, we are here in this weekend focusing on one of the two main wings of practice, of compassion. But as I think briefly mentioned already earlier in response to, I think, one of the questions, is we need to have an integrated approach. That if we only practice one of two of these wings, we'll end up in trouble. And that's sometimes what we see when people get into a spiritual path. You know, often people, particularly coming into a spiritual path such as Buddhism, where there's a lot of talk about wisdom and vipassana and overcoming distorted view of reality. So a lot of people are drawn to that wisdom side of the practice, but then forget about the compassion side. And then what can happen is that we're not very much grounded. And through doing this sort of vipassana practice, we can really become self-absorbed, can become very disconnected from the world, even become insensitive to the sufferings of others, and in very extreme cases can become completely unethical, because if we think we're some high level Vipassana or wisdom practitioner, we may be deluded in thinking that, well, now everything I do is with wisdom, so I can do whatever I want, and we become completely unethical. And unfortunately, we do see this happening quite a lot, actually, in the modern world. But similarly, some people coming into spiritual path are very much more drawn to the compassion side, and sometimes leave out the wisdom, and then end up in difficulties as well, not in touch with reality. And if we're simply engaging in compassion without the wisdom, then our compassion can become very biased. Yes, I'll help these people over here because they're very nice people, they deserve help. But these other people over here, horrible, nasty people, I won't help them. In fact, I hope they suffer. They deserve to suffer because they're horrible, nasty people. And then even with the best motivation in the world, we can end up doing things that not only don't help, but create more suffering, lack of wisdom. And then we can end up, and we see this with people who have a lot of natural compassion. We see this in people, particularly like social workers and aid workers, full of enthusiasm, full of compassion, really want to go out in the world and make a difference. And then often within 3 to 6 months, they suffer compassion burnout. So this is a classic example of compassion without wisdom. The wisdom here, the wisdom of knowing what we can do to help, what we can't do to help, and the wisdom of knowing when to rest and look after ourselves. But actually, even the term compassion burnout is misleading, and we'll look at that shortly. But another situation, and we've all experienced this many times in our life, we try to help someone and then they take advantage of us and we suffer. And then often, unfortunately, what happens is people who are naturally compassionate, helping, and people continually taking advantage of them and they suffer, then eventually they go, this compassion doesn't work. I'm just suffering, and they give up compassion. Very unfortunate. Compassion always works. What's not working is a lack of wisdom. So rather than giving up compassion, we just need to add wisdom. Because if we're trying to help someone and we allow them to take advantage of us, that's not compassion, because we're allowing them, we're actually encouraging them in some way to behave badly. That's the opposite of compassion. So the compassionate thing to do is to not tolerate that negative behavior. Don't do cognitive fusion and get angry at and attack them. Rather, have compassion for them, but be very firm about that behavior and say, I will not tolerate that negative behavior. That's completely unacceptable. And so therefore, if we really want to progress, we need to make sure we cover both wings, that we have an integrated approach, because each one will help and support the other one. Very important, and we'll come back to this topic again tomorrow. I want to add a little bit more to that. And so in this program, where the foundation of the compassion training is these 4 immeasurables that we're moving through now. We'll come to empathetic joy shortly. We'll look at equanimity first session tomorrow morning. Then we'll build on that foundation with this exchanging self with others, exchanging the selfish, self-cherishing attitude with the attitude of cherishing others. And in that context, this very powerful practice of Glen, of giving and taking. And we've been looking at how to deal with attachment and how to deal with anger. And also we're going to look at how to integrate all of this into daily life in the last session tomorrow. And so the first 2 of the 4 immeasurables we looked at was loving kindness and compassion. And what we saw there is, for both of them, they're not emotions. We often think of love and compassion as emotions, but here in the Buddhist context, love or loving kindness and compassion is not an emotion. It's an aspiration. It's a wish for ourselves to be happy, to be free of suffering. And to do that, we need to know, for loving kindness, we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. Similarly, for compassion, we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how to eliminate those causes. And so if we know those things, then we won't end up in this predicament that Shantideva says, that is, those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. And so again, what we saw here was that to eliminate the cause of suffering and thereby be liberated from suffering and thereby achieve liberation from suffering, the underlying practice is vipassana. The vipassana practice of emptiness, to come to realize emptiness, to come to realize there's no independent me, no independent objective world. Everything is interdependent, and thereby overcome attachment to pleasant, aversion to unpleasant, all the other mental afflictions and suffering that they produce. But if we want to have a direct insight into emptiness, we saw that the basis of that is shamatha, is to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind, because we need that mind of shamatha to have a direct insight into emptiness and to have as a basis for engaging in shamatha, ethics, because if we're engaging in harmful ethical behavior, that's really not going to provide a very good basis for engaging in shamatha practice. A lot of agitation in the mind, probably a lot of external unconducive conditions as well because of that unethical behavior. And we saw here that with both loving kindness and compassion, we practice them in stages, first ourselves, and then slowly expand out through the friends, strangers, difficult people, and then eventually to all living beings, which is immeasurable loving kindness and compassion. So they're the first two that we've looked at. And in that context, we looked at attachment and anger. There's two of the three core mental afflictions, that both of these mental afflictions are really coming from this distorted view of reality that sees independent me, independent objective world. And then if we see something pleasant, it seems like objectively that is the source of my happiness, and then we end up with attachment to it. Or if we see something unpleasant, it seems like objectively that's the source of my suffering, aversion, and magnifies into anger. And so we had a look at how these both mental afflictions are the two of the three core mental afflictions, and to develop the wish to be free of them, and then dispelling some misconceptions with both attachment and anger. And then lastly, here in context of anger, is this idea of cognitive fusion. And I want to probably go back to that a little bit more tomorrow, because I think that's very important, can be very, very helpful in terms of not only dealing with mental afflictions, but also in terms of cultivating loving kindness and compassion, particularly for difficult people. And so there we saw that in terms of dealing with anger and attachment, first, again, we need a clear understanding, and to understand that both anger and attachment just lead to suffering, and therefore develop the aspiration to be free of them. And together with that, to really cultivate this view of genuine happiness, to really understand and appreciate the source of happiness and suffering is not out there anywhere, it lies within our mind. Because as long as we have the view, the source of happiness and suffering is out there, then the natural response will be, if something pleasant happens, attachment. Unpleasant, aversion, anger, hostility, and so forth. And then on that basis, when to deal with anger, attachment, or any mental afflictions for that matter, we need mindfulness. When they start to arise, if we can simply watch them, we're free of them. We don't need to fight with them. We won't get caught up in them. They can't harm us. They can't do anything. They will simply dissipate because we're not feeding them. And then in addition to that mindfulness, which we develop in shamatha, we can apply some antidotes to mental affliction. So we've had a look at a number of antidotes. A lot of these antidotes come within the vipassana wing of practice, particularly the antidote of impermanence, the antidote of emptiness. And so here again, we can see that in terms of this compassion wing of practice, in terms of dealing with these mental afflictions, if we have an integrated approach where we're focusing not only on the compassion wing, but also on the preliminary practices, the shamatha and vipassana, then we can have an effective approach to dealing with our mental afflictions. And so on the context, just to talk a little bit about these preliminary practices, how to have a good foundation for compassion practice and for dealing with these mental afflictions. And we looked at these briefly in the last weekend's module on the shamatha practice. So similarly, these preliminary practices are also the foundation for all of the main practices of shamatha, compassion, vipassana. And so just to go through them briefly again here is that these are often called the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. Turn the mind away from looking out there for happiness and the source of suffering. Turn the mind inwards. The first 2, to reflect on this precious human life, to really to have an aspiration to make our life meaningful, so not to waste our life, to realize we have this precious opportunity, we can really make our life meaningful. And together with that, to reflect on death and impermanence, to really understand this precious opportunity we have now, not going to last forever. So let's make our life meaningful right now and not put it off, so that we're one of these people later in our life, look back on our life and we're full of regrets at having wasted our life. And then at the foundation level, how to make our life meaningful. The third of the preliminary practices is to reflect on the causality of our actions, to understand that harmful actions lead to suffering, beneficial actions lead to happiness, and thereby, on that basis, to adopt an ethical lifestyle. And this is, I think, the foundation of any meaningful lifestyle, and certainly the foundation of any Buddhist path. And then on that basis, then the 4th one here is, again, to really reflect on suffering and its causes, happiness and its causes, to really cultivate this view of genuine happiness, to really understand that the source of happiness, source of suffering lies within our own mind. And then we can really develop effectively loving kindness and compassion, the wish to strive for that happiness, the wish to be free of that suffering. So these preliminary practices are crucial also here for compassion practice. And we shouldn't think that because they're called preliminary practices, that's something we do a little bit when we're a beginner, tick, 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 done. Let's get on to the main practice and forget about these preliminary practices. In fact, preliminary practices are important at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. They are the foundation for all other practices. So we need to establish that foundation. We need to keep cultivating that foundation if we're going to have an effective basis for not only shamatha, for compassion, for vipassana, for all the main practices. I can't overemphasize this point enough. Otherwise, without that foundation, all these main practices will collapse. They won't work at all. Now, before we go to the practice of empathetic joy, I'd like to look at what's commonly referred to as compassion burnout. There is certainly burnout, but technically it's not compassion burnout. And to highlight that, I'd like to read a little bit from a book by Matthieu Ricard, well-known French Buddhist monk. And his book is Altruism, the Power of Compassion to Change Yourself and the World. And this excerpt's coming, there's an excerpt put on this website here we see. And this, what I've got here, is part of that excerpt called From Empathy to Compassion in a Neuroscience Laboratory. And so Matthieu Ricard says the following. He says, in 2007, along with Tanya Singer, who's a neuroscientist researcher, I was in Rainer Goebbels' neuroscience laboratory in Maastricht as a collaborator and guinea pig in a research program on empathy. Tanya would ask me to give rise to a powerful feeling of empathy by imagining people affected by great suffering. During a pause after a first series of periods of meditation, Tanya asked me, "What are you doing? It doesn't look at all like what we usually observe when people feel empathy for someone else's suffering." And then he said, I explained that I had meditated on unconditional compassion, trying to feel a powerful feeling of love and kindness for people who were suffering, but also for all sentient beings. When I engaged in meditation on altruistic love and compassion, Tanya noted that the cerebral networks activated were very different from the ones activated in empathy. In particular, the network linked to negative emotions and distress was not activated during meditation on compassion, while certain cerebral areas traditionally associated with positive emotions, with the feeling of affiliation and maternal love, for instance, were. So we arrived at the idea that burnout was in fact a kind of empathy fatigue and not compassion fatigue. And then he goes on, he says, these three dimensions, love of the other, empathy, which is resonance with the other's suffering, and compassion are naturally linked. When altruistic love encounters suffering, it manifests as compassion. This transformation is triggered by empathy, which alerts us to the fact that the other is suffering. One may say that when altruistic love passes through the prism of empathy, it becomes compassion. The person who feels compassion and kindness can develop the strength of mind and desire to come to the aid of the other. Compassion and altruistic love have a warm, loving, and positive aspect that standalone empathy for the suffering of the other does not have. And so here then he summarizes in the following way. He says, so it was clear from my perspective that if there was an empathy fatigue leading to the syndrome of emotional exhaustion, there was no fatigue of love and compassion. So if we simply have empathy for others' suffering, then that can lead to empathic distress, empathy exhaustion, empathy burnout. He says, without the support of love and compassion, empathy left to itself is like an electric pump through which no water circulates. It will quickly overheat and burn. So empathy should take place within the much vaster space of altruistic love. But remember, altruistic love or loving kindness, to understand that, we have to have the wisdom, understanding what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness. And so that's what he says in the final paragraph. He says, it is also important to consider the cognitive aspect of compassion. In other words, understanding the different levels of suffering and its manifest and latent causes. We will be able to thus place ourselves in the service of others by helping them effectively while still preserving our inner strength, our kindness, and our inner peace. And so to summarize all of that, empathy precedes compassion. But if we simply have empathy and a lack of wisdom, understanding suffering, the cause of suffering, happiness, the cause of happiness, then simply seems like there's no hope. And then we just get overwhelmed by all that suffering that we have empathy for, and we'll end up with this empathic distress or burnout. Whereas if we have that empathy, together with the wisdom, understanding suffering and its causes, happiness and causes, then that empathy will result in compassion and we won't have burnout. You can't have burnout wishing ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So therefore, what we see here again is the importance of the two wings of practice, that compassion without the wisdom wing can lead to empathic distress, can lead to burnout. Whereas with wisdom, that empathy will manifest then as compassion. So let's now go to the third of the four immeasurables, empathetic joy. Empathetic joy in Sanskrit and Pali is mudita. And empathetic joy is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others never to be separated from happiness. So actually, in other words, it's a rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good fortune. So it's really focusing on the positive aspects of ourselves and others. And so this is something very important, particularly in the modern world, because in our modern world, we have this obsessive focus on the negative. We see that always in the media, everywhere. And not only that, we do it with cognitive fusion. So to really help provide a balanced view of ourselves and others, we really also need to focus on the positive aspects. So that's what this empathetic joy does for us. And here's a nice quote I like from a modern day philosopher, William James, who says, for the moment, what we attend to is reality. And unfortunately, we're in the modern world, we're attending to all the negative aspects. So that becomes our reality. It becomes doom and gloom because all we're attending to is that. So that's what we actually perceive, just negative. So we need to focus on the positives. And part of that is practicing gratitude, is acknowledging all the good things, all the things that we receive. We tend to take things for granted. We don't appreciate things until we've lost them or about to lose them. So therefore, to really practice gratitude. And then we can really get a positive or a balanced view of ourselves and others, focusing on the positive aspects. But again, here, we need to avoid cognitive fusion. If someone's behaving in a good way, we should not praise the person. Because if we praise the person saying, you're a great person, then chances are it could become an ego trip and thinking, oh, yes, I'm very special. In fact, I'm better than everyone else. So if we're going to focus on the positives, then don't do cognitive fusion, but praise their behavior. So instead of saying you're a great person, say you did a great action. But because that person may normally do a cognitive fusion, even though you say you did a great thing, in their mind, they may hear, I'm a great person. So even better than saying you're a great person, simply say, wow, that was such a wonderful thing. That action was so wonderful. Leave out the you. Then there's less likely that they'll do the cognitive fusion. But we really need to praise our own and others' behavior, but not with cognitive fusion. Now, what are the obstacles to this empathetic joy, this rejoicing? The far enemy, what's directly opposite, is instead of being happy when someone has something good happen, we are jealous, we have a lot of envy. And so how to deal with that, as we've seen with attachment and anger, we need mindfulness to see it, view of genuine happiness, and apply antidotes. So same method as with the attachment and anger. And then the near enemy is when we start rejoicing, but for very meaningless, frivolous things. We rejoice when there's not something not meaningful happens. So therefore, the antidote to that is loving kindness, is to really focus on what is happiness and its causes. So we really can rejoice in a more meaningful way. But we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow morning. These near enemies, I want to really focus on that. So that's the practice of empathetic joy. Let's do a meditation on empathetic joy now. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Empathetic joy is focusing on the positive aspects of ourselves and others, rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good fortune. And so, first bring to mind a person who you know well, who radiates joy and well being. And think of this person's physical presence, their words, and their actions. And as you focus on this person's joy, open your heart to that joy and take delight in it. Next, think of someone for whom something wonderful has happened recently. Try to picture the scene very clearly. And recall the delight of this person and share in their joy. And then next, direct your attention to someone who inspires you with their virtues. Virtues such as generosity, kindness, and wisdom. And rejoice in these virtues and for all those who are recipients of this virtue. And not forgetting yourself. You've made an effort to attend this program, wanting to improve and develop yourself. So take joy in this. Now direct your attention back along the timeline of your life to your earliest childhood years. And try to recall the earliest kindness you can remember experiencing from another person. And take delight in this other person's kindness they have shown to you. And then slowly move along the timeline of your life from this earliest memory, moving slowly through your childhood years, adolescent years, and adult years, right up to the present day. And recall all the people who were kind to you, helped you, and supported you in your life. And as you breathe out your delight and your gratitude that people have shown you such kindness, that they've brought such kindness to the world. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Got plenty of time for question answer. So if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat. Anything yet or
Not yet.
not so far?
We'll give them a second.
Okay, good. You can ask any questions from any of the 3 sessions, not just the material from this session. Anything we've covered today is okay. Seems like there's no questions, huh?
Oh, we have a question. Okay.
Good.
So Vadas is asking, what is the Buddhist way to evaluate between wanting to do things for yourself and take care of a family member?
We need to, again, use wisdom. If we don't have wisdom, then what can happen is either we become completely selfish and just ignore everyone else, or we could feel like, well, I need to look after the family, and then we neglect our own welfare and we just do things for the family and we become exhausted and there's burnout as that we mentioned. So we need to have that wisdom there and use that as best we can. Now, in any given situation, there's no book you can go to that says do this. It doesn't exist because every situation is unique. We have to evaluate every situation on its own merits, and then using whatever wisdom we have, whatever compassion we have, based on that, we respond. And as best we can. I mean, we can't do more than that. No one can ask more of that than us, more of us than that. And sometimes we will make mistakes. And when we, not if we make mistakes, when we make mistakes, not do cognitive fusion, go, oh, I'm just a bad person, and beat ourselves up. Simply acknowledge, okay, I did my best, I made a mistake, I'll learn from that, improve my wisdom, so next time I'll do something different so I can improve. So we move forward. Otherwise, if we're in a situation where we go, I don't know what the best thing to do is, so I'm not going to do anything, that in fact may be worse than doing something. So, we can't just sit there paralyzed. We need to respond in one way or another. And sometimes the response may be actually to do nothing. For example, if someone is yelling at us and they're completely out of control with anger, then wisdom might say, well, whatever I say is just going to make their anger worse. So the smartest thing for me to do now is keep my mouth shut, let them blow off a bit of steam, let them calm down a bit, and then later maybe I can try to address the situation when they're not caught up in their rage. So yes, sometimes the best thing to do is to do nothing, in terms of waiting for a better opportunity to respond in future. So again, we just have to use wisdom and compassion to decide. And, we have certain responsibilities. Maybe we've got family responsibilities that, maybe we're a parent or something, or we're caring for someone, and we have certain responsibilities. But as part of that, enacting that responsibility is a responsibility towards ourselves. That if we neglect that and we allow ourselves to be physically and mentally run down, then how are we going to help other people? How are we going to help family members? How are we going to help anyone else? We can't. So therefore, we need to make sure that as part of our activities where we do help family members and so forth, we make sure that we take time to help ourselves in terms of developing ourselves, resting and so forth, and so that we are in an optimal situation for helping others. And this is a point that is sometimes, again, there's some confusion or doubt. And we'll talk about this point a little bit more detail tomorrow, because we'll be talking there about the self-cherishing and cherishing others. So it comes back up in that context. So I'd like to add a little bit more into that comment tomorrow, but we'll leave it till tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Joel wants to know, and he says the three things we talked about were aspirations. Can you please explain a bit about the actions that need to come along with these aspirations?
Sorry, I missed the start of that. Say again.
So the three things we talked about today were aspirations.
The three things, aspirations, yeah.
So can you please explain a bit about the actions that need to come along with these aspirations?
Yeah. Again, this is where the wisdom comes in. It's if we in any behavior, the intention behind it is key. So if we get the intention right, which is the intention to help, the intention, the wish to be free of suffering, loving kindness, compassion, and so forth. If we get that right, then we're in a good starting point. And then we need to make sure we add wisdom to evaluate the situation to see how in this particular situation would be best to respond. But again, there's no book that says this is the answer. This is what you need to do in terms of the action, because every situation is unique. And so we need to evaluate every situation on its own merit. But if we make sure that our intention is as pure as possible, and we add whatever wisdom we have, and with that, of course, part of wisdom is if we're in a situation completely out of our depth, then part of that would be to ask someone who's knowledgeable in that area for help. To, I've got this in situation. What would you advise me to do here? So we can do that as well, of course. But then again, it really is very individual how to act. But if we do those two things, the intention with the compassion and the wisdom, then I think what we do will become more and more clear and obvious. But again, we will make mistakes for sure. And again, not to sort of sit there and think, well, I'm not sure what I should do, so I won't do anything. Maybe that's worse than actually trying to do something. But again, that's all we can do. And then we just learn from our mistakes. That's all we can do. And I think also, of course, part of that wisdom is the view of the genuine happiness, that without that, then it's difficult. If we're still looking at the source of suffering, source of happiness as being out there, even with a good intention, with that false view of reality, that's probably not going to end well in terms of our actions. And then at the deeper level, then the wisdom of emptiness. So if we can really work on that, then that's really going to make it much, much more effective. That's at the deepest level.
So Hannah is asking if you can elaborate about the cognitive fusion about ourselves and our patterns of behavior.
I'm elaborate on cognitive fusion with respect to what, sorry?
To our own patterns of behavior.
Our own patterns of behavior. Yeah. Exactly, they're patterns of behavior. Cognitive fusion, though, doesn't see they're simply patterns of behavior. Cognitive fusion is, you know, if we have a pattern of behavior of always reacting with anger, if that's our pattern of behavior, then cognitive fusion goes, well, I'm just an angry person. You know, that's me, and just beat ourselves up, you know. And no hope, you just better accept that, because I'm an angry person. I've been an angry person my entire life, and I'm just going to stay an angry person. I'm not going to change. It's impossible for me to change, because we're wrongly identifying with our behavior. So not to do cognitive fusion is to simply understand that is a pattern of behavior. It's not me. It's a pattern of behavior. It's a strong, maybe it's a strong habit, maybe it's a strong pattern of behavior, but because it's a pattern of behavior, therefore it can change. Maybe it's not easy to change, but it can change. We're not stuck. And so without cognitive fusion, then with cognitive fusion, when we have those strong patterns of behavior, we'll feel stuck. We'll feel like, well, that's me. No hope. I'm stuck there. Whereas if we don't do cognitive fusion, we may acknowledge, yes, I have some very strong habits there that have been there for quite some time, but they're not me. They're just habits. And let's see what I can do to change those habits, because habits can change. We can change everything. And so therefore there will be some hope then, if we're not wrongly identifying with the habit patterns. And if we just, and then we can still, because if we do identify with cognitive fusion, we're going to probably, and if they're to do with negative behavior patterns, then we're certainly going to be suffering low self-esteem, self-hatred, and all of those things. And we're going to be stuck, and that's it. Whereas if we don't identify with it, we can have good self-esteem, we can still feel good about ourselves, but at the same time, acknowledge, yes, I have these strong behavior patterns that I react with anger very easily, and I react with that and craving and that, but they're just behavior patterns. And then we can look at working at overcoming them. And I think here, certainly in the Buddhist path, is that we have, again, many approaches for that. I mean, shamatha, simply being able to, just observing those habit patterns, already weakening them. Because if we can observe them, we're not caught up in them. They can't, and then we won't feed the habit patterns. And then in addition to that, we can, the loving kindness and compassion, the wisdom, the vipassana, the emptiness, all of these things we can start to work on. If we don't do the cognitive fusion, if we feel good about ourselves, then we can really work to change those habit patterns. Maybe one more question, if there's one more.
There's a few more. We'll ask the one that's next. Natalie is asking, when I'm feeling angry, I usually don't feel intention to harm. Does it mean I'm not really angry?
Well, again, as we saw, the way that anger is used in psychology and probably in everyday life is not exactly how we're using the word here. Again, angry, when we say I feel angry, for us, it's an emotion, anger is an emotion. But in the Buddhist perspective, what we're translating as the word anger is not an emotion, it's an intention to harm. So that's why we need to be clear about, is that when we see the word anger in Buddhism, we're not exactly using it in the same way as we normally use the word in daily life. So this is part of the difficulty in translating Buddhist terminology, is that often these Sanskrit and Pali terms, there is no word in English that has the same precise meaning. And so we sort of try and pick something that's a little bit close, but then we end up with these confusions. And this is, I think, as an example, is that anger for us is usually an emotion, and, I'm angry. It doesn't, it's not fitting exactly the meaning of the word that we had. That's why whenever I'm using these terms in the Buddhist context, I try and really define what they mean. So therefore, here, when we use the word anger, the inbuilt is the intention to harm. I'm not suggesting that how we use in everyday life, when we feel angry, there's always an intention to harm. So that's what we need to understand. Otherwise, otherwise then we won't understand these Buddhist concepts. And again, anger, again, in Buddhist psychology, as I mentioned, in the modern psychology, we talk a lot about emotions, but actually there's no word for emotion in Sanskrit or Tibetan. There's no word in Sanskrit or Tibetan that means emotion. And when we look at all these mental afflictions, most of them, or a lot of them, are these intentions. So in Buddhist psychology, it's not so much about the physical and verbal displays, but what's driving them. And so that's why we see these mental afflictions, but also the loving kindness, compassion, generally are often defined as intention to harm, intention to, the wish or an aspiration. It's at this level. So that's why it's often a little bit difficult to talk Buddhist psychology based on modern psychology, where it's a lot about emotions. Whereas in Buddhist psychology, it's not really about emotions. So that's why it's a little bit disjointed sometimes. Maybe one more question if we have.
Yeah, we can. So is compassion something that can change from day to day? There are some days where I feel that I have a lot of compassion and room for other people, and some days that a lot less or not at all.
Sure. Exactly. I mean, that's why we need to continue to cultivate it and strengthen it so that it doesn't fluctuate so much. And by strengthening it, it will be more even, and particularly together with the wisdom, because if we're lacking the wisdom, then also due to that lack of wisdom, there can be a lot of fluctuations from day to day. So if we continue to cultivate compassion on a daily basis and strengthen it, you'll find it'll be more even. And if you do together with the wisdom, also that will help to keep it more even and balanced. It won't be so up and down then. But that'll take time, like developing any habit. Okay, let's leave it there. We've run out of time. So to finish today, let's dedicate all of our efforts from today using the Shantideva dedication prayer, as we did, I think, in the last weekend, 2 weekends ago. So while I read out the dedication prayer, you might like to reflect on the words. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And so next session, tomorrow morning, same time, we'll finish off the 4 immeasurables in terms of equanimity. And then sessions 5 and 6 will build on that in terms of the exchanging self with others Tonglen practice as a basis for this bodhicitta. That's it for now. So enjoy the rest of your day and see you same time tomorrow morning. Bye
you
now.
very much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glen.
Tamam Müslüman. Okay, Aslı.